In 1894, inside the Naumkeag Steam Cotton Company in Salem, Massachusetts, a woman named Hannah Leary reached down to pick something up beneath her carding machine. Her hair, which she normally wore braided and pinned, was loose that day. The horizontal shaft running beneath the machine caught a single strand. In less than 1 second, the shaft wound her hair around itself and tore her entire scalp from her skull. Doctors spent the next week trying to reattach it. The Boston Post ran daily updates on whether she would survive. And the paper mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that this kind of accident happened all the time. This is the story of the line shaft, the spinning steel rod that ran across the ceiling of every factory in the industrial world, the rod that powered every machine in the building, and the rod that grabbed hair, clothing, and limbs and did not let go. Before electric motors, factories ran on a single power source. A steam engine in the basement or a water wheel at the foundation turned one main shaft. That main shaft connected to secondary shafts that ran horizontally across the ceiling of every floor. These were line shafts. They spun continuously at anywhere from 60 to 250 revolutions per minute, and they transferred power downward through leather belts and pulleys to every machine on the floor below. A typical textile mill in the 1880s contained hundreds of feet of overhead line shafting. Writing in 1909, engineer James Hobart said you could scarcely step into a shop or factory of any description without encountering a mass of belts that seemed to monopolize every corner of the building. Shafts ran overhead, belts ran downward, pulleys connected everything. The entire system was exposed, spinning, unguarded, and directly above the heads of every worker in the room. The way it worked was straightforward. The main shaft from the engine turned a vertical shaft that rose through the building. On each floor, horizontal line shafts connected to that vertical shaft and ran the length of the room, suspended from the ceiling by iron hangers. From each line shaft, leather belts dropped down to individual machines. If you wanted to run a loom, you shifted its belt onto the fast pulley. If you wanted to stop it, you shifted the belt onto a loose pulley that spun freely. But the line shaft itself never stopped. It kept spinning whether the machines below were running or not. This meant that a worker could shut off their own machine and still be standing directly beneath a rotating shaft. The belt might be loose, the loom might be still, but the steel rod above their head was always turning, always waiting for contact. The system also required constant maintenance. The bearings that held the shafts had to be oiled regularly or they would seize. In many factories, workers called oilers were assigned to walk the length of the building, climbing ladders and reaching up to lubricate the bearings while the shafts were still spinning. They worked inches away from rotating steel, carrying oil cans, reaching over and around moving belts. It was one of the most dangerous routine jobs in the factory. Oil dripped from the bearings constantly, coating the floor and the machines below. The belts shed dust and fiber into the air. The entire overhead system turned the factory into a greasy, dusty, spinning environment that workers simply learned to live in. Here is why that matters. A line shaft does not look dangerous. It is a smooth steel rod, usually 2 to 4 inches in diameter, spinning steadily on the ceiling. It does not make threatening noises. It does not emit heat or pressure. It looks like part of the building. Workers walked under these shafts for entire careers without incident. The danger was invisible because the shaft was always there. But a smooth rotating shaft is one of the most dangerous objects in mechanical engineering. It does not need teeth or blades or edges to kill. All it needs is contact. A single thread of clothing touching the surface of a spinning shaft will wrap around it. Once that thread wraps, it pulls. Once it pulls, more material follows, and once enough material is wound around the shaft, the person attached to that material goes with it. The physics are simple and merciless. A shaft spinning at 200 revolutions per minute completes one full rotation in less than 1/3 of a second. The moment contact is made, the wrapping begins. By the time a worker realizes what is happening, their arm or their hair or their clothing is already wound tight around the shaft. There is no time to react. There is no way to pull free. The shaft does not slow down. It does not stop. It keeps turning at the same speed, with the same force, powered by a steam engine that has no idea a human being is caught. Could you imagine working directly beneath a spinning rod that you could not shut off? That is what every factory worker in the 1800s did every day of their working life. The injuries were specific and horrifying. Scalping was the signature wound. Women with long hair were the most frequent victims. A strand of hair touching the shaft would wrap and pull, tearing the entire scalp from the skull in a fraction of a second. In 1911, a 13-year-old girl named Carmela Teoli was working as a doffer at the Washington Mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts. She had been on the job for 3 weeks. Her hair got caught in a cotton twisting machine powered by the overhead shaft system. Part of her scalp was torn off. She spent 7 months in the hospital. The company paid her medical bills, but nothing else. When she returned to work, the bread and roses strike had begun. She was brought before Congress to testify about conditions in the mills. She was 13 years old, but scalping was only one type of injury. When clothing caught the shaft instead of hair, the results were worse. A North Carolina Occupational Safety and Health Administration investigator described one fatality at a sawmill where an unguarded, smooth-rotating horizontal shaft at waist height grabbed a worker's loose shirt tail and wrapped him around the shaft, the investigator said, like limp spaghetti. Children were especially vulnerable. A contemporary account from the early 1800s describes a 10-year-old girl named Mary Richards working near a horizontal shaft about a foot from the floor. Her apron caught. She was drawn by an irresistible force and thrown to the ground. An eyewitness described hearing the bones of her arms, legs, and thighs snap one after another as the shaft wound her body tighter and tighter into the machinery. Her blood scattered across the frame and streamed onto the floor. The shaft did not stop until her mangled body jammed between the mechanism and the floor. Every bone was broken. She was carried away lifeless. A Manchester doctor testifying before Parliament in 1819 reported that children's hands and arms were constantly being caught in machinery. In many cases, the muscles and skin were stripped down to the bone. At one school serving factory children, 47 out of 106 students had been injured by machinery, nearly half. Here is the part that should make you angry. None of this was necessary. Guards existed, enclosures existed. The technology to shield a rotating shaft from human contact was simple and cheap. A metal cover over the shaft, a cage around the pulleys, a barrier between the spinning steel and the workers beneath it. These solutions were known, available, and almost never installed. Why were they not installed? The same reason the elevator shaft stayed open. The same reason defective columns held up the Pemberton Mill. Guards cost money. Guards slowed down maintenance. Guards made it harder to shift belts between pulleys. And the workers getting scalped, crushed, and torn apart were cheap to replace. A factory in 1890 could lose a worker to a shaft accident on Monday, and have a new immigrant in that position by Wednesday. The math was brutal and simple. And when accidents did happen, the system was designed to protect the factory, not the worker. Newspapers routinely described shaft deaths as the result of the worker's own carelessness. When a man at a screw factory in Connecticut had his head caught between a balance wheel and a machine frame in 1885, the paper said he lost his life from an overassurance of his ability. The New York Times called it carelessness. The factory was never investigated. The machine was never modified. The worker was buried and replaced. This was standard practice. There was no workers' compensation. There was no mandatory safety inspection. Employers were held harmless when accidents occurred. If a worker was injured, they were simply out of a job. If they were killed, their family received nothing. The long line of new immigrants waiting for work meant there was never a shortage of replacements. Factory owners understood this, they calculated it, and they acted accordingly. By 1900, factory deaths in the United States had reached 35,000 per year. Injuries affected 500,000 people annually. The line shaft was not the only cause, but it was one of the most persistent. Between 1980 and 1989 alone, at least 346 farm workers died from entanglement injuries involving power takeoff-driven shafts and drivelines. That is in the modern era, with modern safety standards supposedly in place. Nearly 10,000 non-fatal entanglement injuries occurred on farms between 1982 and 1986. Of those, 864 involved the loss of a body part. What finally ended the line shaft was not outrage, it was electricity. When individual electric motors became affordable in the early 1900s, the entire overhead system became unnecessary. Instead of one steam engine powering hundreds of machines through miles of shafting and belting, each machine could have its own motor. The shafts came down, the belts disappeared, the pulleys were removed. The difference between the two systems was not just convenience. It was a fundamental change in how energy moved through a building. With line shafts, every machine had to be positioned in relation to the overhead shaft. Factories were designed around the power transmission system, not around the production process. Machines were placed where belts could reach them, not where they made the most sense for workflow. The entire layout of the building was dictated by a spinning rod on the ceiling. Electric motors freed machines from the ceiling. A motor could be placed anywhere. Power came through a wire, not a belt. Machines could be rearranged without redesigning the entire transmission system. And most importantly, when a motor failed, only one machine stopped. When a line shaft failed, the entire factory went dark. The results were immediate. Firms that switched to electric power reported significantly less employee sick time. Production increased using the same equipment because machines could be positioned for efficiency rather than proximity to the shaft. Oil stopped dripping from overhead bearings. Dust from deteriorating belts stopped circulating in the air, and workers stopped being scalped by rotating steel above their heads. But the transition was not instant. Large, well-funded plants converted first. Smaller factories delayed for years, sometimes decades. Some kept line shafts running long after electric motors were available because the old system still worked and replacement cost money. In rural operations, particularly on farms, power takeoff shafts connected to tractors continued to kill and maim workers well into the modern era. The machinery changed, the danger did not. As long as there was a rotating shaft and a human being near it, the physics remained the same. As long as the shaft kept spinning and the machines kept running, the only people paying the price for the outdated system were the workers beneath it. The line shaft taught the same lesson as the open elevator shaft and the defective iron column. That the most dangerous feature of a workplace is the one that becomes invisible through familiarity. A spinning rod on the ceiling does not look like a threat. It looks like infrastructure. It looks like background. It looks like something that has always been there and always will be, until the moment a strand of hair touches it. And then it becomes the last thing a worker ever sees. Thanks for tuning in. For more stories about the machines and structures that killed the people who worked inside them, subscribe.